They built a gate across the only road that led to my property. A brand new steel-reinforced monument to arrogance standing right where my family's driveway used to meet Old Mill Road. I remember sitting in my truck that morning, engine idling, watching the keypad flash red as if mocking me. My name's Larry Stewart, and I don't scare easily. When the HOA president Aurora Mitchell told me I was no longer authorized to drive to my own cabin, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. So instead of shouting or begging, I did something she never expected. I went digging through the county records, and what I found turned her precious gate into my monthly paycheck. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and what time it is, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy seeing HOA bullies learn expensive lessons. When my Uncle Raymond passed away in 2018, I thought I was just inheriting a quiet piece of land, not the start of a slow-burn war with an HOA. The property had been in our family since the early 80s. 28 acres of thick woodland tucked behind the Crestview Hills subdivision with a small hunting cabin, a clear creek, and a gravel drive that stretched half a mile to meet Old Mill Road. That road was the only way in or out. No back trails, no alternate exits, just that single stretch of gravel connecting my gate to the rest of civilization. My uncle used to joke that it was his one-lane highway to heaven. He loved that place more than anything. Back when he bought it in 1983, Old Mill Road was a county-maintained public road. The county would grade it twice a year, fix the ditches, and send the snowplows when winter hit. But sometime in the 90s, when the local budget went dry, the county gave up maintaining the outer section. A developer swooped in, bought the adjacent fields, and built the Crestview Hills subdivision, complete with their shiny new homeowners association. As part of that deal, they agreed to maintain Old Mill Road for their residents. Now, my uncle wasn't a fan of HOAs. He called them little kingdoms with too much power and not enough sense. But the first board back then was friendly. They had an informal arrangement he could keep using the road as long as he didn't block traffic or tear up the pavement. In return, he'd occasionally help patch potholes or trim brush near the ditch. Simple neighborly stuff. When I inherited the property, I made sure to keep that same quiet peace. I worked in town as a civil engineer about 40 minutes away and only visited the cabin a couple of weekends each month. I paid my property taxes on time, kept the place clean, never threw loud parties, and stayed out of HOA business. In return, nobody bothered me. For 2 whole years, life was peaceful. On early Saturday mornings, I'd drive my old F-150 down that gravel stretch, windows open air, filled with pine and creek water. The road wound through the subdivision for maybe 200 yards before reaching my gate, but I barely noticed the houses. Kids played on front lawns, people walked dogs, and I'd wave politely when passing by. Sometimes an older gentleman named Paul Gardner would stop me to chat about fishing. It was that kind of neighborhood, or so I thought. Everything changed when Aurora Mitchell became HOA president. Aurora was the type of woman who could turn a bake sale into a military operation. Early 50s, silver blonde hair always perfectly in place, pearl earrings, even when gardening, and a clipboard seemingly glued to her hand. I first met her at the mailbox cluster near the road. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So you're the cabin owner up the hill," she said. "We were just discussing your access at the last board meeting." That sentence alone should have been my first red flag. Aurora had a background in corporate management, the kind of person who loved hierarchy control and enforcing order. Within a few months of her taking over Crestview, Hills started to look like a gated fortress. She had speed bumps installed every 100 feet. She ordered new road signs, had the ditches regraded, and hired a private security company to monitor non-residents. I figured she was just overzealous. After all, plenty of HOA presidents like to leave their mark. Then came the email. It was a form letter from the HOA office addressed to non-resident road user. It said that anyone using Old Mill Road regularly was now required to contribute to road maintenance, a mandatory fee of $150 per quarter. Attached was a payment link and a stern note that unpaid accounts could result in revoked access privileges. I almost laughed. Access privileges. To reach my own land, I replied politely, explaining that my right of access wasn't a courtesy, it was an easement recorded decades ago, meaning it couldn't be revoked, bought, or sold. I even attached the county document for her reference. Aurora didn't respond. 2 weeks later, I got another letter, this time hand-delivered. It warned that vehicles without HOA permits could be towed if found on private roadways. I sent another polite email quoting, "State property law." Again, no reply. The next time I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed men in orange vests measuring distances along the roadside. New wooden stakes appeared near the culvert. A rumor started floating around. that the HOA planned to upgrade security. I didn't think much of it until I found out what security meant. One Friday afternoon, as I was loading lumber into my truck, my phone buzzed. It was Paul Gardner. "Larry," he said quietly, "they're putting up a gate. Right across Old Mill." I froze. A gate. As in, blocking the road. "Yep, big metal thing, automatic." Aurora said it's for community safety. But from what I can tell, it's going up right between your drive and the highway. I drove out that evening, and there it was, a massive black steel gate spanning the entire width of the road, complete with a keypad security camera, and a sign that read, "Private property, residents only." I stepped out of the truck, stared at it for a good minute, then dialed Aurora's number from the HOA website. She picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said as calmly as I could, "there seems to be a gate across Old Mill Road." "Yes," she replied, matter-of-factly. "It was approved by the board, for resident access only." "I need to use that road to reach my property," I reminded her. "Well, you're not a resident, Mr. Stewart, but you can apply for guest access. There's a small annual fee and a background check process." I let that sink in. "You're saying I need permission to reach my own land?" She gave a short laugh. "You're welcome to discuss it at our next board meeting." Then she hung up. That night I drove out to the gate again just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The keypad glowed in the dark red digits flickering like an insult. I pressed the button marked "Call for Access." It rang 6 times, then clicked off. No one answered. I waited 40 minutes in the cold. Finally, a resident I vaguely recognized stopped his car on the other side. He hesitated, then rolled down his window. "You're the cabin guy, right?" he whispered. I nodded. He glanced around nervously. I probably shouldn't, but he tapped a code into the keypad and the gate opened with a slow metallic groan. "Thanks," I said quietly. "Don't mention it," he muttered. "Aurora told us not to give you the code." That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just some bureaucratic mix-up. She was deliberately trying to cut me off. Maybe she thought I'd cave and start paying fees like everyone else. Maybe she wanted to prove a point. But she just made one mistake: she underestimated me. As the gate clanged shut behind me, I promised myself something. I wasn't going to argue, shout, or break it down. I was going to win the one way she'd never see coming legally. The next morning, I called my old friend James Porter, a real estate lawyer I'd worked with, on a few infrastructure projects. I explained everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't even sound surprised. "Larry," he said, "I've seen HOAs pull stunts like this before. Let's dig. Every road, every plat, every easement has a story. And if there's one thing I've learned, paperwork always tells the truth." We spent the next few days combing through public records, county archives, and maps older than Aurora herself. Somewhere buried in that pile of dusty paperwork was the key to unlocking this entire mess. And when we found it, I realized I didn't just have a way to open that gate. I had the power to own it. The next week I watched from my truck as the HOA crew finished their masterpiece of arrogance. They had poured fresh concrete for the gate posts, installed bright LED floodlights, and placed a shiny Crestview Hills private entry sign right on what used to be public access. Aurora Mitchell stood nearby in her neat white blazer, clipboard in hand, directing workers like a movie director on set. Every command came out crisp and rehearsed. She was enjoying herself far too much. I parked a few yards away and approached her calmly. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," I said, hands in my jacket pockets. She gave me a tight smile. "Mr. Stewart, you're not supposed to be inside the work zone. I'm just checking what's being built across the only road to my property." She raised an eyebrow. "This gate is for the safety of our residents. There have been concerns about non-members using our road." "Non-members?" I echoed, my tone cooling. "You mean me?" Aurora didn't answer directly. She scribbled something on her clipboard. "The board has decided access will now require electronic authorization. You'll need to apply for a guest card. I can send you the form." "Guest card," I repeated. "To drive to my own cabin." "Yes," she said sweetly. "It's a small administrative fee, $50 a year, and a background check, of course. Standard procedure." I let out a quiet laugh. "You're kidding." Her lips curved into that kind of smile people wear when they believe they're untouchable. "Not at all. Rules are rules, Mr. Stewart. Surely a civil engineer like you appreciates structure." For a moment, I just looked at her, this woman who had convinced herself that a flimsy HOA regulation trumped a county-recorded easement. Then I nodded once. "You'll regret this," I said softly. Aurora frowned. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said, turning toward my truck. "That's a promise that I know how to read deeds better than you know how to swing a clipboard." By the time the gate went fully operational the following weekend, the entire neighborhood buzzed about it. To the residents, it felt like an upgrade Aurora's security initiative. She sent out polished newsletters about how the gate would protect property values and limit unwanted outsiders. Most people clapped politely at her efforts, never realizing that one of those outsiders owned the land just beyond the trees. Saturday morning, I drove out to the cabin for the first time since the installation. The keypad blinked at me like a digital guard dog. I pressed the button marked "Call for Entry." A robotic voice answered "Access Restricted. Please contact HOA management." So I did. I called the number listed on the sign. It rang 12 times before going to voicemail. I left a polite message, then another, and another. No one ever called back. After 45 minutes of sitting in my idling truck, a small SUV rolled up behind me. I stepped out and waved. The driver's window slid down. It was Paul Gardner, the neighbor who'd warned me before. "Still no access?" he asked quietly. "Not unless I apply as a guest," I said dryly. Paul grimaced. "Aurora's gone power crazy, man. She told everyone at the meeting that you're some off-grid squatter freeloading off our road." I laughed a short, humorless sound. "She knows I own that property outright. She doesn't care," he whispered. "She just wants total control. You didn't hear it from me, but she bragged that she'd teach you to follow the rules." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, clarity. "Thanks, Paul. You've done more for me than she ever will." He hesitated, then leaned toward the keypad and punched in a code. The gate slid open with a metallic groan. "You didn't get this from me," he muttered before driving off. I drove through slowly, watching the heavy steel arms close behind me. That sound, the slow mechanical lock clicking shut, was seared into my brain. Back at the cabin, I made coffee, sat on the porch, and stared at the tree line. Somewhere behind those trees, Aurora probably thought she'd won. To her, I was just one stubborn outsider with no power against a homeowners association. But I'd built bridges, dams, and highway foundations in 3 different states. I understood how things were built, and more importantly, how they could legally fall apart. The next morning, I called my lawyer, James Porter. I told him everything: the gate, the access denial, the guest fee, the voicemail silence. He listened quietly. When I finished, he said, "Larry, don't get mad. Get records." That became our motto for the next week. We started with county archives. James knew where to look: dusty folders in the recorder's office, some dating back to the 1970 seconds. I spent hours poring over maps with faded pencil lines, showing property divisions, long before Crestview Hills ever existed. We found survey plats, deed transfers, old highway department documents, all cross-referenced to Old Mill Road. By midweek, the puzzle started forming a clear picture. The county had indeed abandoned maintenance of the road in 1994, but that didn't mean the entire thing automatically became HOA property. The first quarter mile, the part nearest the county highway, still sat on an easement retained by the original landowners. That easement, we discovered, had been transferred along with my uncle's property, which meant it now belonged to me. I remember sitting there staring at the plat map, heart pounding. The HOA had paved, gated, and controlled a road that they didn't fully own. In legal terms, that was like building a fence on someone else's land and then charging them rent to walk through it. "James," I said slowly, "they built the gate on my easement." He grinned. "Congratulations, my friend. You own their front door." We made copies of everything: maps, deeds, official letters, and assembled a clean packet labeled "Evidence Easement Ownership of Old Mill Road." 2 days later, James drafted a cease and desist notice. It was beautifully worded, firm, polite, and devastatingly clear. To the Crestview Hills Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, you are to cease any obstruction, restriction, or limitation of access to Old Mill Road across the section legally identified as Parcel 23B owned by Mr. Larry Stewart. Any continued interference will constitute trespass and unlawful restriction of easement rights. You have 30 days to remove all barriers from said section or face legal action. I signed it, and James mailed it with return receipt. 3 days later, Aurora called. Her tone was icy. "Mr. Stewart, I received your letter. You seem confused about the ownership of that road." "I'm not confused," I said evenly. "I have the documents from the recorder's office. The gate is standing on my easement." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Crestview Hills has maintained that road for decades. Continuous maintenance grants us claim through adverse possession." "Not over an active easement," I replied. "The law is clear on that." There was a long silence on the line. Then she hissed. "You're bluffing." "Check your mailbox," I said. "The paperwork's on its way." When the certified letter arrived, Aurora must have realized the gravity of it because for the first time since this entire mess began, she went quiet. But not for long. A week later, I received an email from the HOA's attorney, David Renshaw, threatening to counterclaim for misuse of easement rights and accusing me of harassment. It was a desperate move the kind lawyers pull when they know they're losing but want to scare you off. James read it, smiled, and said, "Let them talk. The law's on your side, and they're about to learn that paperwork cuts deeper than pride." That night, I drove past the gate again. The keypad blinked in the dark, the same red digits as before. But this time, instead of anger, I felt something else: satisfaction. Because for the first time since Aurora had decided to teach me a lesson, I knew exactly how this story would end. And she wasn't going to like the price of her lesson. The following weekend, I loaded up my truck with tools and supplies and headed toward the cabin. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the cease and desist letter went out, and I hadn't heard a single word from the HOA. No call, no email, no response from their lawyer. I figured maybe silence meant compliance. Maybe Aurora had finally realized she'd overstepped and quietly backed down. I was wrong. As soon as I turned onto Old Mill Road, I saw the same metal gate standing proudly, not only still there, but freshly painted. The keypad glowed brighter than before, the Crestview Hills logo, newly stenciled above it in clean white letters. 2 new security cameras watched from each post. Aurora had doubled down. I pressed the call button again. Same robotic voice, access restricted, contact HOA management. I called the HOA number printed on the gate sign. No answer. I left a message. Nothing. I tried again 5 minutes later. Still nothing. So I waited. 30 minutes. 40. 50. The November wind whistled through the trees, rattling the dry leaves across the hood of my truck. I could have turned back. I could have driven home and called the sheriff or my lawyer. But that was exactly what Aurora wanted to prove I'd yield. After almost an hour, headlights approached from the opposite direction. A gray SUV slowed beside the gate. I recognized the driver immediately, Paul Gardner, the only resident in that neighborhood who'd ever treated me decently. He rolled his window down halfway and leaned out. "Locked out again?" he asked. "Looks like it," I said, forcing a smile. "Seems I'm not on the approved list." Paul sighed. "Aurora told the whole board you're being uncooperative. She said you refused to pay your share of maintenance and that the gate's your own fault." "My share," I repeated. "The woman built a fortress on my land." "I know," he whispered, glancing around nervously, "but she's got everyone convinced you're trying to freeload. She even said you might be living there illegally." I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, tell her my mortgage-free property comes with an actual deed, the kind that doesn't require HOA approval." Paul shook his head, looking weary. I shouldn't do this, but he reached out of his window and punched a few numbers into the keypad. The gate beeped, then slid open slowly. "Thanks," I said quietly. "Don't mention it," he muttered. "Aurora said if anyone gives you the code, they'll lose access privileges. Guess I'm already on her bad side." "You and me both," I replied. The gate closed behind me with its usual metallic groan, the kind that now sounded more like a challenge than a barrier. I drove up to the cabin, unloaded my gear, and sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, staring at the empty woods. I'd spent years building bridges and managing infrastructure contracts. I'd seen bureaucracies fight over single inches of dirt. But there was something about an HOA that took ordinary pettiness and gave its structure, rules, and authority a machine powered by egos. And Aurora Mitchell was the perfect operator. By Monday morning, I was back at the courthouse, filing a motion to enforce the cease and desist order. My lawyer, James Porter, looked both proud and amused as we walked out of the clerk's office. "You're really going to push this?" he asked. "I'm not the one pushing," I said. "She built the gate. I'm just holding her to the law." That afternoon, James sent a copy of the court filing directly to the HOA's attorney, David Renshaw, along with a polite notice. "Our client is prepared to escalate this matter to civil court if immediate compliance is not achieved." Aurora must have received it by the next morning because that's when she called. Her voice was cool and sharp. "Mr. Stewart," she began, "I understand you've filed something with the county clerk. That's very aggressive for someone who claims to want peace." "I wanted peace for 2 years," I said. "You built a gate. That gate is for residents' protection," she insisted. "You're not part of our community, and your constant use of the road constitutes trespassing." I smiled into the phone. "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, it's your gate that's trespassing. It sits squarely on my easement." "You're welcome to check the maps." "I don't need to check anything," she snapped. "Our lawyer says your lawyer is about to lose in front of a judge," I interrupted. "You have 10 days to remove the obstruction or I'll let the court order it for you. Silence. Then finally, her voice lower, this time, you think you can bully us? No, I said calmly. You're mistaking competence for bullying. She hung up. 3 days later, I drove past the gate again. It was still standing. But now a brand new no trespassing private HOA property sign had been bolted right into the fence post. If Aurora thought intimidation would work, she'd picked the wrong guy. I called James again. File it, I said simply. Let's take it to court. What followed over the next few weeks was a blur of paperwork and patience. James filed an injunction with the county judge. The HOA filed a counterclaim claiming adverse possession, the idea that because they had maintained the road for over 20 years, it was now legally theirs. It was a ridiculous argument, and James was thrilled. They're going to hang themselves with their own paperwork, he told me, grinning. The court date was set for mid-December. I wore my best suit and brought every document, neatly organized the deed to my property, the recorded easement plat, and even the county abandonment order from 1994. Aurora arrived, flanked by her lawyer and 2 board members dressed like she was attending a press conference. Her eyes darted toward me, briefly cold and defiant. When the judge entered, the courtroom settled. James presented the evidence, first walking through the timeline like a textbook. He explained the easement's chain of ownership, the county's relinquishment of the road, and how the section Aurora's HOA had paved and gated still legally belonged to me. Then came the cherry-on-top photos of the gate posts, driven directly into my property line, complete with GPS coordinates. Aurora's lawyer objected, but the judge silenced him with a hand. Mr. Renshaw, the coordinates match the official plat, correct? The lawyer hesitated. Technically, yes. Then your client has built a barrier on land she doesn't own, the judge said flatly. Aurora's composure began to crack. Your Honor, that road has been maintained by Crestview Hills for decades. Surely that counts for something. The judge leaned forward. It counts for good citizenship, Mrs. Mitchell, not for ownership. The easement stands. The gate comes down. Bang, gavel. Decision rendered. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt my shoulders loosen. I turned to James, who just whispered, "Told you paperwork wins wars." Outside the courtroom, Aurora stormed past me, heels striking the marble floor like gunfire. She muttered, "You'll regret this, Stuart." I smiled. Maybe. But you'll regret it sooner. The court order required the HOA to remove the gate within 30 days and restore full access to my property. It also stated that any future obstruction would result in contempt of court and fines. But even then I wasn't satisfied. The gate had been an inconvenience, sure, but Aurora's arrogance had cost me time, legal fees, and months of stress. So with James's help, we filed for damages. If she wanted to play hardball, I could play too, by the book, line by line, until she learned that laws aren't suggestions. Aurora's lawyer sent me one last email before the holidays accusing me of holding the community hostage. I replied with one sentence: the community should choose better captains. By New Year's, the gate was gone. All that remained were 2 lonely concrete pads and a scar of disturbed gravel. I drove through that stretch slowly, feeling the crunch under my tires. It wasn't just the sound of gravel, it was the sound of vindication. But Aurora wasn't done yet, and neither was I. Because the road might have been open again, but the real victory was still to come. The week after the court order, things finally seemed to quiet down. The gate was dismantled, the cameras taken down, and the road reopened. For a brief golden moment, I thought it was over. Aurora Mitchell had lost. I had my access back, and the HOA could crawl back to their meetings about mailbox paint colors. But the peace didn't last. I should have known that Aurora wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She was the kind of person who couldn't stand being proven wrong, especially not in public and definitely not in court. A few days after the ruling, I started getting letters again. Not from the HOA this time, but from their lawyer, David Renshaw. Each one was more passive-aggressive than the last. Per our review, one letter began, Crestview Hills HOA intends to assert continued right of maintenance over Old Mill Road, including the section that intersects your property in accordance with state statutes governing shared infrastructure. Translation: they were still trying to claim ownership just under a new excuse. I called James Porter. He laughed the moment he read it. They're playing legal whack-a-mole, he said. They lose one argument, they pop up with another. But maybe it's time we stop reacting and start taking control. That's when he explained an idea that would change everything. Larry, he said, remember that easement you own, the one for the quarter-mile stretch of Old Mill Road? That strip doesn't just give you the right to travel, it gives you authority to control who else can use it. I frowned. You mean, they need my permission? Exactly, James said, smiling. And from now on, permission can come with a price tag. The realization hit me like a freight train. For months, Aurora had treated me like an intruder on her private road. But legally, she was the one trespassing on mine. The HOA had been maintaining and using my easement for years, without consent effectively leasing it for free. I leaned back in my chair, trying not to grin. So what you're saying is, I could start charging them rent. Not only can you, James said you should. And after what they put you through, I'd say a fair market rate is overdue. We spent the next week documenting everything: traffic counts, maintenance costs, comparable private road leases, even property value assessments. James wanted airtight numbers, so no one could claim I was being unreasonable. Meanwhile, I quietly visited the property line to measure and photograph the section of road that lay on my land. It was a surreal feeling standing there on cracked asphalt, realizing that this small stretch of pavement was about to flip the entire power dynamic. I imagined Aurora sitting at her HOA desk, drafting another self-righteous newsletter, completely unaware that the ground beneath her tires now belonged to me in every meaningful way. Once the paperwork was ready, James sent a formal notice to the HOA board. It was calm, concise, and devastatingly polite. To the Crestview Hills Homeowners Association, effective immediately. All vehicular use of Old Mill Road across Parcel 23B shall require written consent from the owner, Mr. Time, Larry Stewart. Such use may be granted through a formal access agreement, subject to standard lease terms, including a monthly maintenance fee. Continued use without consent will be considered trespassing. Aurora must have read it 20 times before calling me. Her voice shook between fury and disbelief. You can't charge us to use our own road. Your road, I asked, pretending to sound puzzled. That's strange. According to the county maps, it's mine. And you've been driving over it for years. You're holding the entire community hostage, she screamed. I'm holding you accountable, I said evenly. You built your gate on my land. You blocked me from my own property. I think a little rent is fair compensation. This is extortion, she hissed. No, Aurora, I said, savoring every word. This is property law. The phone went silent for several seconds before she hung up. 2 days later, her lawyer sent a furious email threatening another lawsuit. But this time, the board members weren't so eager to follow her lead. Several residents had grown tired of the legal circus. One of them, Paul Gardner, quietly reached out to me. Larry, he said, some of us think Aurora's lost it. The lawsuits are draining the HOA funds. People are talking about a vote to remove her. Can't say I'd complain, I said. I just thought you should know, he added. Most of us don't blame you anymore. We read the court documents. You were right all along. That conversation was all the confirmation I needed. Aurora's empire was crumbling from within, and I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was wait. A week later, I received another letter from the HOA, this time from the board itself, not their lawyer. The tone was completely different. Dear Mr. Stewart, we acknowledge your ownership of the easement section of Old Mill Road and wish to negotiate terms for continued community use. Please contact our treasurer to discuss a potential agreement. I could practically hear Aurora grinding her teeth through the paper. When the meeting finally happened, she was there, sitting stiffly at the end of the conference table, her pearls perfectly aligned, her jaw locked. The treasurer, an older man named Harold Klein, did most of the talking. We're prepared to offer compensation for your easement, he said, clearing his throat nervously. A one-time payment of $5,000. I smiled politely. That's generous, I said, but it's not nearly enough. You've been using the land for decades. I'm willing to offer a formal lease renewable annually at $500 a month, adjusted for inflation. Aurora's pen snapped in her hand. $500 a month? That's absurd. It's market rate, I said, and cheaper than losing your only road into the neighborhood. The silence that followed was heavy. I could see the board members exchange nervous looks. They knew I was right. If they refused, I could revoke access altogether, forcing them into a 4-mile detour on an unpaved county path. The property values in Crestview Hills would plummet overnight. Within 2 weeks, the HOA caved. They signed the lease agreement, issued a $19,000 check to cover damages and back compensation, and agreed to the $500 monthly rate. The ink was barely dry before Aurora started damage control, sending newsletters painting me as a greedy outsider profiting off the community. It didn't work. The residents had seen enough. They knew the truth, that her ego had cost them nearly $20,000 and a permanent monthly expense. By the next board election, Aurora's name wasn't even on the ballot. Paul called me afterward, chuckling. You'll like this. The new president is Susan Miller. First thing she did was apologize on behalf of the whole neighborhood. Did she mention lowering the rent, I asked. He laughed. She tried, but everyone told her not to risk another war. When I hung up, I sat on the porch of my cabin, listening to the creek trickling down through the rocks. Somewhere down the hill, cars rolled quietly over that stretch of pavement, my pavement, on their way to the subdivision. And every mile they drove, every delivery, every tire tread that touched it paid me a little reminder that sometimes revenge doesn't have to be loud or cruel, it just has to be lawful. The HOA had tried to gate me out, now they were paying rent to get in. And the best part, the checks were always signed by the HOA treasurer with Aurora Mitchell's name printed neatly in the memo line, authorizing payment. Somewhere she must have gritted her teeth every single time. For a few blissful months, I thought the storm had passed. The HOA was paying their monthly rent on time, the road stayed open, and peace finally seemed possible. But if I'd learned anything from Aurora Mitchell, it was that she didn't believe in peace, only in control. Aurora might have lost the title of HOA president, but she hadn't lost her obsession. Even after being voted out, she still lurked around meetings, whispering to old allies and stirring resentment. The new president, Susan Miller, was reasonable, polite even, but I could tell she was under constant pressure from Aurora's shadow. One chilly March morning, Susan called me directly. "Mr. Stewart," she began nervously, "we've been reviewing our annual budget. The residents are concerned about the ongoing lease payments. Some believe the rate is too high." I smiled to myself. "The rate's fair, Mrs. Miller. It's in writing, approved by your board, and adjusted for inflation just like any professional lease." "I understand," she said softly, "but Aurora's been vocal. She claims the board was coerced. There's talk of hiring a new attorney to challenge the agreement." I leaned back in my chair. "Mrs. Miller, I'd advise your board not to waste more money on lawyers. The court already ruled on ownership. If they want to risk another lawsuit, they'll lose again, and I'll raise the fee next year." She sighed. "I'll try to keep things calm, but you know how persuasive Aurora can be." Yes, I knew exactly how persuasive she could be, and how vindictive. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I spotted something suspicious. I was driving home one evening when I noticed construction equipment parked near the southern edge of my easement, bulldozers, survey flags, fresh tire marks in the mud. The next morning, I hiked down to investigate. There were 2 men in hard hats, clearing brush right at the property boundary. "Morning," I called out. "Who sent you?" One of them shrugged. "We're with Mitchell Construction. Said the HOA approved a secondary access project. New road going around the hill." I stared at him. "You mean through my land?" He looked uncomfortable. "Just following orders." "Of course. Mitchell Construction, Aurora's family business." I snapped a few photos with my phone and called the county zoning office. Within an hour, I was speaking to Inspector Kelly, a sharp woman who'd handled my easement filings before. "They didn't file for a permit," she said immediately after checking the database. "If they're grading land, they're in violation of environmental and zoning codes." "Can you send someone out?" I asked. "Already on it." By noon, a white county truck rolled up. The inspector took one look at the bulldozer and shut the project down on the spot. She handed the foreman a bright orange notice: "Cease work. Immediately unauthorized construction on private property." I thanked her as she packed her clipboard. "I had a feeling Aurora Mitchell was behind this," she said with a knowing smile. "That woman's been a thorn in our office for years. By the end of the day, the equipment was gone. But I knew Aurora wasn't finished. When someone like her lost control, they didn't stop, they got desperate." 3 nights later, my phone buzzed at 2:00 a.m. It was Paul Gardner. "Larry, you'd better come down to the gate." I threw on my jacket and drove straight to the road. What I found made my jaw tighten. The HOA's security lights were flashing red, and several residents stood around looking bewildered. The barrier, the new automatic arm I'd installed at the edge of my easement to monitor vehicle entry, had been smashed clean off its base. The camera housing hung by a wire. Aurora stood nearby, arms crossed, wearing a smug half-smile. "Maybe now you'll think twice about bullying people, Mr. Stewart." I looked at the wreckage, then back at her. "That's felony vandalism, Aurora." "Prove it," she said. "Oh, I plan to," I replied calmly. The motion sensors recorded everything. Her face paled slightly just for a second. The next day, I turned over the footage to the sheriff's office, clear as day. Aurora, under cover of darkness, marching up with bolt cutters, swinging a crowbar at my equipment like a woman possessed. When the deputy called to confirm they were pressing charges, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. A week later, she showed up at my cabin, standing at the edge of the driveway in a bright red coat, demanding to settle this privately. "You've humiliated me," she yelled. "You turned the entire community against me." "No, Aurora," I said evenly. "You did that all by yourself. I just let the law do its job. You don't understand, she said, voice cracking. That neighborhood was my life. I built it. I protected it. I folded my arms. You built a prison, not a neighborhood. For a long moment we just stood there, her breathing hard, my silence louder than words. Then she spun on her heel and stormed away. 2 days later, the HOA sent an emergency notice to all residents effective immediately. Aurora Mitchell was banned from board meetings and community facilities pending legal review. Word spread fast. Even residents who once admired her started whispering about how she'd gone too far. Property values dropped from the negative publicity. Real estate agents complained that buyers were Googling Crestview Hills lawsuit and walking away. Meanwhile, the rent checks kept coming every month right on time, with HOA access lease typed neatly in the memo line. I spent my evenings sitting on the cabin porch, sipping coffee, while watching cars roll over the section of road that now paid for my property taxes. Sometimes I'd wave at passing drivers just to watch the confusion on their faces. A few even waved back like they somehow knew the story and admired the quiet victory. But peace didn't mean complacency. After Aurora's stunt, I added new security-reinforced gates, motion lights, cameras linked directly to cloud storage. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd built a gate to keep me out, and now I had one keeping her out. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a black SUV pulled up to my gate. Out stepped Aurora, looking tired, older somehow. She didn't shout this time. She just stood there. I came to apologize, she said. I didn't believe her at first. She continued, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard. I let my pride get in the way. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, but I was just protecting my ego. You were right about everything. I studied her face carefully. She looked broken, but honest. I never wanted to destroy your life, Aurora, I said. I just wanted to drive to my own property without asking permission. She nodded slowly. I know, and I'll have to live with that. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her SUV. The engine started taillights glowing red through the dusk, then she drove away. That was the last time I ever saw her. The sheriff later told me she'd sold her house and moved 2 towns over. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just gone. The HOA slowly stabilized under Susan Miller's leadership. The residents repaired their reputation, fixed their budgets, and learned to leave me alone. Sometimes Susan would call just to make sure everything was running smoothly. She even sent me a Christmas card, a picture of the community's entrance, decorated with wreaths and fairy lights. Beneath it, she'd written, "Thanks for teaching us what fairness really means." It was the kind of ending that didn't need fireworks, just silence, order, and balance restored. Aurora's reign had ended with the sound of her own gate crashing down. And the funny part, every month I still got that $500 check. Signed now by Susan, but printed with the same HOA name, Crestview Hills Association. Each time I deposited it, I couldn't help but smile. Because that check was more than money. It was proof that sometimes justice doesn't shout. It just waits patiently and lets arrogance write its own rent. For a while, things felt almost too calm. The HOA had retreated into silence. The rent checks arrived promptly on the 1st of every month, and Susan Miller, the new president, made sure every correspondence was courteous, professional, and neutral. It was the kind of calm that comes only after a hurricane has blown through and everyone's too afraid to breathe wrong. But karma, I've learned, doesn't end when you think it's over. It waits for the perfect encore. The encore began one muggy July evening. I was out back fixing the screen door of the cabin when I noticed headlights creeping down the road long after sunset. The vehicle moved slowly, too slowly, like it didn't want to be noticed. I turned off the porch light and watched from the shadows. It was a silver Lexus SUV. The driver's side window rolled down, and I caught a flash of platinum blonde hair. Aurora Mitchell. She was back. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the driveway. The SUV stopped abruptly, brake lights flaring red. I walked closer and said evenly, "You're trespassing, Aurora." The window rolled down a little farther and her voice floated out, shaky, bitter. "You think you've won, don't you?" I sighed. "I don't think." "I know. The law made it pretty clear." Her voice sharpened. "You humiliated me, Larry. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone." I took a step forward. "You did that yourself." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached down, opened her glove compartment, and tossed something out the window. It landed at my feet, a crumpled HOA newsletter from the month she was removed from office. Her name still appeared under the message from the president's section, crossed out in red pen. "Keep it," she spat, "a souvenir of what you destroyed." Then she hit the gas tires, screeching, as she sped away into the dark. I stood there for a while, flashlight in hand, watching her taillights fade into the night. There was something tragic about it. Aurora had spent years convincing herself she was the hero of her own little world, keeping order, enforcing rules, protecting her community. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She was just another person who couldn't admit she'd been wrong. A few days later, karma caught up in the most ironic way possible. It was Susan Miller who called me first. "Larry," she said, half laughing, half exasperated, "you're not going to believe this." "What now?" Aurora drove through the neighborhood gate last night. Literally through it. Smashed the arm right off. Claimed it malfunctioned. The security footage says otherwise. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. Guess she finally got tired of waiting for permission. She also hit a decorative planter, Susan added. The police cited her for reckless driving. She was screaming something about property rights when they pulled her over. The irony was too perfect. Aurora Mitchell, the same woman who'd spent a year fighting to control who could and couldn't use a road, had just crashed through a gate trying to reclaim control she'd never have again. But the story didn't stop there. A week later, I received a letter from the HOA's insurance provider requesting footage from my security cameras. Apparently, Aurora was trying to claim that my new barrier system installed at the edge of my property had somehow distracted her during the crash. It was laughable, but James Porter told me to play it smart. "Send them the footage," he said. "All of it. Make it neat, chronological, time-stamped. Let the truth bury her." And it did. The video showed everything: Aurora's SUV racing down the hill, swerving erratically, headlights blazing, music thumping through open windows. There was no obstruction, no distraction, just her own temper steering the wheel. The footage spread fast through the HOA community. By the weekend, everyone in Crestview Hills had seen it. I didn't share it publicly, but someone on the board must have leaked it. And in the age of smartphones, gossip travels faster than electricity. Residents whispered about how their former president had finally lost it. Some even nicknamed the incident the Great Gate Break. For the first time since inheriting the property, I drove through the subdivision and didn't get dirty looks. Instead, people waved. A few even stopped me to talk. One man watering his lawn said, "Good job standing your ground, Mr. Stewart. We needed someone to put her in her place." Another woman joked, "If you ever run for HOA president, you've got my vote." I laughed politely but kept driving. I had no interest in their politics. I just wanted peace, and now I finally had it. A few weeks later, Aurora's lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful removal was dismissed in court. The judge cited her previous vandalism charges and public misconduct as justification. According to Paul Gardner, she packed up her house 2 days later and sold it at a loss. She moved to Florida, Paul said over the phone. Can you imagine? There's probably another HOA down there waiting for her. Poor souls, I muttered. Still, I couldn't help feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Aurora had been cruel, yes, but she'd also been human. Obsessed with control, but in her mind it was about order, safety, predictability. She'd just taken it too far, and like all people who try to cage others, she'd ended up trapping herself. Months passed. The lease continued smoothly, and my lawyer helped set up an automatic transfer for the monthly payments. No more checks, no more drama, just quiet transactions and open roads. One autumn morning, I was down by the creek clearing fallen branches when I noticed Susan Miller's car pulling up. She stepped out with a warm smile and a thermos in her hand. "Brought you some coffee," she said. "Consider it a peace offering on behalf of Crestview Hills." "Much appreciated," I said, taking a sip. It was good, strong, and sweet, like closure in a cup. She looked around the property, the trees shimmering gold in the sunlight. "You've got a beautiful place here. I can see why you fought for it." "I didn't fight for it," I said quietly. "I defended it." She nodded. "Fair point. For what it's worth, we've learned our lesson. The HOA's focusing on real maintenance now: lawns, drainage, community events. No more crusades. That's good to hear." Before she left, she hesitated, then said softly, "By the way, I heard Aurora's not doing well, health-wise. Maybe the stress caught up." I nodded slowly. Karma usually does. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset reflect off the road, the same road that had once been a battlefield. Now it just looked peaceful. Birds hopped along the fence line, the wind rustled through the pines, and for the first time in years, there was no tension in the air. I thought about Aurora wherever she was, probably staring at another gated community, wondering why every fence she built eventually boxed her in. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd tried to wall me off, and in the end, she'd walled herself out. The next morning, I received an email from Susan confirming that the HOA had approved another 5-year renewal of the lease with a small increase per the inflation clause. The new payment schedule began in January. I chuckled, forwarded it to James, and wrote "Merry Christmas" to us. His reply came back instantly. You should frame the first invoice. Call it the Mitchell Memorial Road. And maybe I will. Because every time a delivery truck, landscaper, or moving van passes over that stretch of asphalt, I'm reminded that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly under a set of Goodyear tires paying interest every mile. Aurora wanted control. She ended up funding my retirement. And somewhere out there, I imagine she still flinches every time she hears the word gate. 6 months after Aurora Mitchell's dramatic exit, Crestview Hills was almost unrecognizable. The tension, the gossip, the little fiefdom of fear she'd built, all of it had evaporated. The lawns were greener, the streets quieter, and for the first time since I'd inherited my uncle's land, the road felt like just a road again. Every first of the month, my bank account pinged with the same quiet deposit, $512.22 adjusted for inflation. The lease payment from the HOA, the irony never got old. Each transaction came with an automated note, lease payment per Old Mill Road easement agreement, Crestview Hills HOA. There were no more late-night calls, no angry letters, no threats of trespassing violations. Just peaceful routine. Sometimes I'd drive down that quarter-mile stretch windows down, listening to the tires hum against the asphalt that once symbolized a war zone. It still made me smile. One crisp Saturday morning, I found a letter tucked under the cabin door. It wasn't printed on HOA stationery, just a plain white envelope with neat handwriting. Inside was a short note from Paul Gardner, my reluctant ally during the chaos. Larry, you'll be happy to know the neighborhood's been calmer since you taught everyone a lesson in humility. Even the board meetings end early now. Susan's doing great as president, and people finally talk about things that actually matter, like fixing sidewalks and keeping the creek clean. Funny what happens when folks stop playing dictator. Also, I heard Aurora moved again somewhere down in Florida. Guess she couldn't stand living near a road she doesn't control. Take care, friend. You earned your peace. I read that letter twice, then tacked it to the cabin wall beside the old survey map. The one showing that thin gray strip of land labeled Parcel 23B. The same strip that had caused a year of frustration, court battles, and ironically, a steady income stream. That afternoon I brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and thought back over everything that had happened. The gate, the lawsuits, the arrogance, the sheer absurdity of it all. People like Aurora don't just pop up in HOAs, they exist everywhere, offices, schools, even families. People who mistake authority for ownership rules for righteousness. They convince themselves that order gives them power when in truth, it just hides their fear of losing control. Aurora built that gate to trap me, but in the end it was her own obsession that trapped her. I remembered her words that night in the driveway, "You think you've won." At the time I just smiled and walked away. But sitting there now with the sun cutting through the treetops and the sound of the creek murmuring nearby, I realized something. Winning wasn't about money or revenge, it was about reclaiming peace. My uncle used to say land remembers who respects it. I never understood that until this whole ordeal. Because the land had protected me in the end, not through violence, but through its history, through the quiet permanence of legal lines drawn decades ago. All I'd done was honor them. And Aurora. She'd spent so much time redrawing lines that weren't hers to move, she forgot where she stood. That evening, I decided to take a walk down Old Mill Road. The air was cool, the trees heavy with summer leaves. I passed the old spot where the gate had stood, the concrete pads still faintly visible beneath the gravel. Grass had started to sprout between the cracks, reclaiming what arrogance once tried to fence off. As I stood there, a minivan pulled up behind me. A young family I didn't recognize waved cheerfully. "You're Mr. Stewart, right?" the father called out. "The easement owner," I laughed softly. "That's me." He grinned. "Heard about what happened before we moved in. That's legendary. We tell new neighbors, don't mess with the guy who owns the road." I shook my head. "I'm not the villain they made me out to be. I just wanted to get home." "Exactly," he said. "And now everyone can. So thanks." They drove off, and I found myself smiling. Maybe that was the real legacy, not the rent checks or the court order, but the quiet reminder that standing your ground calmly and lawfully can make people think twice before pushing others around. As the sky turned orange and the cicadas started their evening chorus, I walked back to the cabin. On the way, I stopped by the edge of the creek where my uncle's old fishing chair still sat. I brushed off the dust, sat down, and let the world fall silent around me. It had been a long road, literally and figuratively, but for the first time I felt like I'd come full circle. Before the sun dipped completely, I pulled out my phone and took a picture, the cabin, the road, the golden light spilling through the trees. I sent it to James Porter with a single caption, "No gates, just peace." His reply came a few minutes later, "That's the best kind of justice." And he was right. Justice doesn't always come in grand gestures or courtroom speeches. Sometimes it's in the stillness after the fight, when you realize you didn't need to destroy your enemy, you just needed to outlast them. Later that night, as the crickets sang and the stars filled the dark sky, I poured myself a drink and opened the ledger where I kept notes on property expenses. At the top of the page, I wrote Lessons from Old Mill Road. Then I listed 3 things that the whole ordeal had taught me. Never underestimate how far ignorance will go when armed with authority. Revenge tastes best when it's legal, clean, and notarized. Peace is worth fighting for, but you don't always fight with fists. Sometimes you fight with paperwork. I closed the ledger and leaned back in my chair, watching the moon climb high above the tree line. Somewhere beyond those woods lay the community that once tried to fence me out, now living quietly under the very contract that paid for my tranquility. Funny how life works. Before heading to bed, I thought about the viewers who'd later hear this story. The people who'd watch the video and shake their heads, maybe laugh, maybe cheer, maybe see a little of their own HOA nightmare in mine. To them, I'd say this: when someone tries to shut you out, don't get angry, get informed. The law isn't just for the powerful, it's for the patient. Learn it, use it, and you'll never have to raise your voice to be heard. And if Aurora Mitchell ever watched it herself, sitting in her Florida condo, sipping sweet tea behind yet another gated entrance, I hope she'd catch the lesson too. That gates don't protect you from karma. They just give it your address. Sometimes life gives you battles you never asked for. You can't choose who tries to fence you out, but you can choose how you respond. Don't let anger drive you to do something foolish. Let wisdom guide you to do something permanent. Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs patience, persistence, and the courage to stand your ground when you know you're right. If this story taught you something, let me know in the comments. Have you ever faced an HOA or a neighbor who thought they owned the world? Tell me your story below. And don't forget to subscribe, because out here on Old Mill Road and beyond, there's always another gate waiting to fall.